Before cities, before farming, before anyone could write down a single word of history, humans were already learning how to build a world from almost nothing. With stone, fire, wood, and imagination, they created shelters, tools, communities, and traditions that would shape everything that came after. But who were these first builders, and how did they transform a wild and unforgiving planet into a place humans could call home? If you enjoy uncovering humanity's forgotten beginnings like this video, subscribe to the channel and join us as we discover the first humans who built a world from nothing. The wind moves across a landscape that does not yet belong to anyone. There are no borders here, no fields divided by stone walls, no roads worn smooth by carts, no towers rising above the horizon, and no written names for the rivers cutting through the open ground. The world is vast, cold in many regions, unpredictable almost everywhere, and inhabited by small groups of humans who carry nearly everything they own on their backs. They follow animals, gather roots, collect seeds, watch the movement of clouds, read tracks in mud and measure distance by memory rather than maps. When they leave a campsite, very little remains behind. A scatter of stone flakes, a blackened hearth, broken bones, perhaps a burial beneath the earth. To modern eyes, it can look like a world built from almost nothing. Yet inside these small communities are the abilities that will eventually create villages, monuments, farms, markets, temples, cities and states. The remarkable part is not that early humans lack these things. It is that over a surprisingly short span of deep time, some of them begin creating systems that had never existed before. Around 20,000 years ago, much of the planet is still shaped by the closing stages of the last ice age. Enormous ice sheets cover large parts of northern Europe and North America. Sea levels are far lower than today because so much water is locked in glaciers. Coastlines stretch far beyond their modern positions, exposing plains that will later disappear beneath the sea. Britain is connected to continental Europe through a broad landscape now known as Doggerland. Southeast Asia includes vast lowlands joining many present-day islands. Across parts of the Middle East, Africa, Eurasia, and the Americas, people live in environments that can change dramatically across generations. Grasslands expand and shrink. Herds shift their routes. Rivers change course. Lakes appear and vanish. Survival depends on flexibility. These people are not primitive in the way older popular histories often imagine them. Their technology is sophisticated for the problems they face. Stone blades are carefully shaped for specific tasks. Bone needles allow fitted clothing to be sewn against cold weather. Spears, traps, fishing equipment, baskets, cords, containers, pigments, ornaments, and shelters all require accumulated knowledge. Some communities travel long distances or maintain connections with groups far away. Materials found at prehistoric sites sometimes originated hundreds of kilometers from where archaeologists discover them, suggesting exchange networks or repeated movement across enormous territories. Human beings already possess symbolic traditions, burial customs, art, and complex social bonds. What they do not possess, at least in most places, is the permanent built environment that later generations will mistake for civilization itself. Mobility is often an advantage. A group that depends heavily on wild resources cannot always remain in one place. Animals migrate. Plants ripen at different times. Water sources fluctuate. A successful community may move through a familiar annual circuit, returning to known valleys, caves, riverbanks, coasts, and hunting grounds. This does not mean wandering aimlessly. The landscape is full of remembered information. Certain places provide fish in spring, nuts in autumn, grazing animals during migration, or protection during winter. Knowledge is stored not in writing but in people, stories, habits, and repeated journeys. That way of life also places practical limits on accumulation. Heavy possessions are inconvenient when a family must move repeatedly. Buildings cannot become too elaborate if they will soon be abandoned. Surplus food is difficult to protect over long periods unless reliable storage exists. Population density remains low in most regions because wild landscapes can support only so many people within a given territory. These constraints do not make settled life impossible, but they make it unnecessary in many environments. Then conditions begin to shift. As the Ice Age weakens, temperatures rise unevenly, glaciers retreat, rainfall patterns change, and ecosystems reorganize. The transformation is not smooth. There are reversals, sudden cold episodes, regional droughts, and generations in which familiar resources become less predictable. Scholars still debate exactly how much climatic pressure drives the later emergence of agriculture and permanent settlements, because no single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. Humans had lived through earlier climatic changes without becoming farmers. Something more complicated is happening. Environmental opportunity, population growth, local abundance, social traditions, competition, experimentation, chance probably combine differently in different regions. One important clue comes from places where wild food is unusually concentrated. In parts of the Eastern Mediterranean and Southwest Asia particularly, the Levant people can exploit rich combinations of wild cereals, gazelle nuts, fruits, fish, and other resources. Instead of constantly following scattered food across immense territories, some communities begin spending longer periods in favored locations. They return to the same places more often. Structures become stronger. Hearths become fixed. Burials accumulate. Storage becomes increasingly important. The landscape starts to contain places that feel less like temporary camps and more like homes. This shift is easy to underestimate because there is no single morning when humanity wakes up and decides to invent civilization. There is no architect drawing the first village, no ruler ordering people to become farmers, no council announcing that wandering life has ended. Instead, thousands of small choices begin reinforcing one another. A family stays longer because food is abundant. A storage pit makes staying practical. A stronger house makes returning desirable. A burial ties memory to a particular place. A neighboring group does something similar. Children grow up knowing one settlement more intimately than earlier generations knew any single campsite. Permanence emerges slowly from repetition. There is strange detail buried inside this transformation. Some of the earliest signs of settled life appear before agriculture is fully established. That complicates the older idea that farming simply causes villages to appear. In certain regions, people first become more sedentary, while still depending heavily on wild resources. They gather plants rather than cultivate fully domesticated crops. They hunt wild animals rather than manage established herds. Yet their settlements can already contain substantial structures, grinding stones, storage facilities, cemeteries, and objects that suggest long-term attachment to place. The implications are enormous. A permanent settlement changes human relationships even before anyone plants a true field. When people stay together, longer disputes become harder to escape. Families must negotiate access to space and resources. Waste accumulates. Food must be stored and defended. Dead relatives remain physically nearby. Neighbors become permanent rather than temporary. Reputation matters differently when the same people see one another every day for years. Cooperation becomes more important, but so does conflict. Something else changes as well. Time itself begins to feel different. Mobile hunters and gatherers often organize life around movement and seasonal abundance. Settled communities increasingly invest in the future of one place. A repaired roof matters because the house will still be used next season. A storage container matters because grain or nuts must last through months of scarcity. A burial ground matters because ancestors remain connected to the settlement. The future begins accumulating physically in buildings, stored food, pathways, tools, and memory. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The people living through this transformation cannot know what is beginning. They cannot see the cities thousands of years ahead. The walls, irrigation canals, bureaucracies, armies, temples, taxes, markets, and kingdoms that will eventually grow from similar experiments in permanence. They are solving immediate problems: where to sleep, what to eat, how to survive winter, when to move, what to store, whom to trust. Yet those modest decisions begin altering the relationship between humans and the earth itself. For most of human existence, the landscape dictates movement. Soon, in a few remarkable places, humans begin attempting the opposite. They remain in one location and gradually reshape the landscape around them. That is the first quiet step toward building a world from nothing. The change begins almost invisibly, with warmth creeping into landscapes that have known cold for thousands of years. Glaciers do not simply vanish. They withdraw in stages, leaving behind valleys filled with meltwater, new lakes, unstable rivers, exposed soil, and enormous tracts of land suddenly available to plants and animals. Forests advance northward, where open steppe once dominated. Herds accustomed to colder grasslands shift their ranges. Some species decline, others flourish, and people who have built generations of knowledge around familiar ecosystems are forced to adapt. The warming that closes the last ice age is not merely a change in temperature, it rearranges the map of survival. Between roughly 20,000 and 11,000 years ago, global sea levels rise dramatically as continental ice melts. The process continues for millennia, eventually drowning immense coastal territories. What is now the floor of the North Sea once includes rivers, wetlands, hunting grounds, and human camps. The Persian Gulf basin is partly exposed land during lower sea levels. Large areas around Southeast Asia form broad connected plains rather than the fragmented islands visible today. Some of the environments most attractive to prehistoric people lie precisely in these low coastal zones, where rivers meet the sea and food is often abundant. Many of those places are now underwater, which means archaeology may preserve only a fraction of the human story from this period. This creates one of the great problems in reconstructing the origins of settled life. Archaeologists excavate what survives, not necessarily what mattered most. A settlement on an inland hill may remain accessible for 10,000 years, while an equally important coastal community disappears beneath tens of meters of water. The evidence remains incomplete, and the missing coastlines may once have supported dense populations that played significant roles in the transition toward more permanent ways of living. Submerged landscapes are now increasingly studied with sonar sediment cores and underwater archaeology, but the scale of what has been lost is immense. Meanwhile, the climate does not move smoothly toward warmth. Around 12,900 years ago, much of the northern hemisphere experiences a sudden return to colder conditions during a period known as the Younger Dryas. Temperatures fall sharply in some regions. Rainfall patterns shift. Vegetation changes again. The episode lasts for roughly a millennium before warming resumes rapidly. For human communities living through it, these are not abstract climate curves. A favoured stand of wild grain may become less reliable. Herds may alter migration routes. Springs may shrink. Forest edges may move. A settlement successful for generations may suddenly face pressure. The Levant becomes especially important because this region lies at the meeting point of Mediterranean woodland steppe and more arid zones. Before fully developed agriculture appears, communities associated with what archaeologists call the Natufian culture are already living in relatively substantial settlements in parts of this landscape. They use stone-built structures, grinding equipment, mortars, sickle blades, and cemeteries. They exploit wild cereals and hunt gazelle among other animals. Their way of life is not identical across the entire region, and scholars still debate how sedentary different communities actually are, but the pattern suggests that some hunter-gatherers are spending much more time in one place than earlier models once assumed. Climate instability may intensify the significance of such places. When resources become unpredictable, people face choices. One solution is greater mobility, moving farther to follow what remains abundant. Another is deeper investment in a smaller territory, gathering more intensively, storing more food, managing particular plants, and defending reliable resources. Different groups can respond differently to the same environmental pressure. That is why climate alone cannot explain agriculture. The same drought does not turn every hunter-gatherer into a farmer, yet climate changes the possibilities. Warmer conditions allow some edible plants to expand into new areas. Longer growing seasons increase productivity in certain regions. Woodland produces nuts and fruit. Rivers and lakes support fish and waterfowl. Wetlands can become extraordinarily rich environments, offering multiple food sources within a relatively small radius. Such abundance makes longer residence possible. A community does not need agriculture if wild resources are diverse and dependable enough. In fact, some of the earliest relatively sedentary societies may have remained non-agricultural, precisely because their environments were rich. This is a useful correction to the assumption that farming must represent obvious progress. Agriculture demands labor. Fields must be prepared, protected, harvested, processed, and sometimes watered. Crops can fail catastrophically. Stored grain attracts pests and thieves. A hunting and gathering community living in an unusually productive environment may have little incentive to exchange diversity and mobility for repetitive agricultural work. The shift only becomes attractive or unavoidable under particular combinations of ecological and social conditions. Population may be one of those pressures. A rich settlement can support more children because mothers no longer need to carry infants across long seasonal migrations, although the demographic details remain debated. More people can then place greater pressure on nearby wild resources. A community that once gathered naturally abundant grain may begin harvesting it more intensely. Harvesting changes which plants reproduce. People may favor stands with desirable traits. Seeds may be carried accidentally or deliberately toward camps. Disturbed soil around settlements creates new growing conditions. Human activity begins altering plant populations long before anyone possesses a scientific concept of domestication. Fire is another subtle force. Humans have used controlled burning for far longer than agriculture has existed. Burning vegetation can encourage new plant growth, improve visibility, attract grazing animals, and reshape habitats. Such practices show that prehistoric people are not passive inhabitants of untouched wilderness. They already modify ecosystems. The later development of farming extends this older relationship, rather than creating environmental manipulation from nothing. Animals respond to these changing landscapes too. As forests expand, species adapted to open cold, steppe lose territory in many regions. Reindeer retreat northward. Some large Ice Age mammals disappear entirely, though the causes vary by species and region. Climate change, human hunting habitat transformation, and their interaction are still debated for several extinctions. Whatever the exact combination the human menu changes, communities that once depended heavily on certain large animals increasingly diversify their diets, turning towards smaller game fish, birds, shellfish, nuts, seeds, and cereals in many places. Archaeologists sometimes describe this as broad-spectrum subsistence, people drawing calories from a wider range of resources rather than relying primarily on a narrower set of large prey. The term sounds technical, but the lived reality is simple. Survival becomes more complicated. More species must be understood. Different tools are required. Food processing becomes increasingly important. Grinding stones appear in greater numbers at some sites because seeds and grains demand labor before they become useful food. A single handful of wild cereal is not impressive. Thousands of handfuls gathered season after season can feed a settlement. But gathering them efficiently requires timing. Harvest too early, and the seeds are immature. Harvest too late, and many scatter before collection. People must learn exactly when certain plants ripen, where the best stands grow, how weather influences them, and how long processed grain remains edible. Knowledge deepens as residence becomes more local. That knowledge begins tying people to particular landscapes. A valley is no longer simply crossed. It is watched. A spring is remembered not merely as water, but as the center of repeated seasonal activity. A stand of wild grain becomes a predictable resource. A grove fishing place or hunting corridor acquires social significance because families return to it over generations. By the end of the Ice Age, human beings are still hunter-gatherers across nearly the entire planet, yet the world around them has changed enough to make older habits less automatic. Coastlines are moving, forests are advancing, species are shifting, familiar landscapes are vanishing beneath water or transforming into something new. And in a few places, instead of continuing to follow the changing world, people begin staying long enough to make the world come to them. A settlement begins with repetition. A fire is lit in the same hollow where another fire burned months earlier. A wall is repaired instead of abandoned. A storage pit is deepened because someone expects to return before the next season has passed. Slowly, places that once held only temporary camps accumulate weight. Stones remain where they were placed. Floors are swept. Burials gather beneath or beside houses. Paths appear between structures. The ground itself begins to remember people. This is one of the most consequential changes in human history, yet it happens without fanfare. No one needs to declare the invention of the village. A village emerges when enough people stop treating departure as the default solution. In the Eastern Mediterranean and Southwest Asia, archaeological sites reveal this process with unusual clarity. During the Epipaleolithic period, especially among communities associated with the Natufian cultural tradition, some groups begin building semi-permanent or permanent dwellings of stone, wood, reeds, and earth. These are not cities. They are not even farming towns in the later sense, but they represent a significant departure from highly mobile settlement patterns. Houses can be circular or semicircular, sometimes partly sunk into the ground with stone foundations supporting lighter superstructures above. Within and around them appear hearths, grinding stones, mortars, bone tools, ornaments, and the debris of repeated daily activity. Sites such as Enon, also known as Ain Malaha in the northern Jordan Valley region, have provided evidence for substantial Natufian occupation. Here, people construct houses and remain connected to the same locality across extended periods. Similar patterns appear elsewhere in the Levant, though each site has its own history and level of permanence. The important point is not that every Natufian community suddenly becomes sedentary. The evidence suggests considerable variation. Some groups likely move seasonally while maintaining favoured settlements. Others may occupy places more continuously, and some probably shift between these strategies depending on environmental conditions. Scholars still debate the exact degree of sedentism at individual sites, but the larger pattern is difficult to miss. Certain communities are investing more labor in place. Investment changes everything because labor creates attachment. A shelter erected for several nights can be abandoned without great loss. A house whose walls require days or weeks of work is different. A storage area filled with gathered food ties people to the months ahead. A cemetery containing relatives ties them to the generations behind. The settlement becomes more than a convenient location. It becomes a physical record of belonging. One surprising feature of these early communities is the presence of cemeteries associated closely with living spaces. Human burials are not new in this period. Much older examples are known. What changes is the concentration of burials in repeatedly occupied places. The dead remain near the living. This can reinforce claims of ancestry identity and attachment to land, although archaeologists must be cautious about assigning precise beliefs to societies with no written records. What survives in the record suggests that certain settlements carry emotional and social significance well beyond simple shelter. At some Natufian sites, individuals are buried with ornaments made from shells, teeth, or bone. Shells can come from distant coastlines, indicating exchange or travel. Such objects reveal networks linking communities across landscapes broader than any single village. Sedentism does not mean isolation. In fact, permanent settlements may become nodes within increasingly complex systems of exchange, marriage ritual, and information. Daily life inside these places is demanding. Food still comes overwhelmingly from wild resources. People hunt gazelle deer, wild boar birds, and smaller animals depending on location. They collect wild cereals, legumes, nuts, fruits, and other plants. Fishing and gathering aquatic resources are important near rivers, lakes, and marshes. The diversity of food can be impressive, but acquiring it requires constant knowledge and work. Wild cereals must be harvested quickly when ripe. Nuts require processing. Meat must be butchered and preserved. Fish may be dried or smoked. Grinding grain on stone is slow, repetitive labor that leaves traces both on tools and on human bodies. Large grinding stones become especially revealing. Some are heavy enough that carrying them long distances would be inconvenient. Their presence therefore supports the idea of repeated or extended occupation. A mobile group can own grinding equipment, but large mortars anchored to a particular place suggest that people expect to use that place again. Technology begins becoming fixed in the landscape. Storage deepens that pattern. Once food can be accumulated beyond immediate consumption, a settlement can survive seasonal shortages more effectively. Yet storage creates new social problems. Someone has to decide where food is kept, who contributed it, who may consume it, and what happens when supplies run low. Archaeology rarely allows those rules to be reconstructed directly, but the problem itself is unavoidable. Surplus introduces questions of access, obligation, generosity, theft, inheritance, and control. The architecture of early villages may begin reflecting these relationships. Houses create boundaries that open camps do not possess in the same way. Inside and outside become more clearly distinguished. Certain objects may belong to particular households. Cooking and sleeping areas become associated with repeated family routines. Children grow up surrounded by constructed spaces rather than temporary shelters. A house can be repaired, enlarged, rebuilt, inherited, or abandoned. Each possibility creates a different relationship to property. This does not mean private ownership suddenly appears in the modern sense. Concepts of possession vary dramatically across human societies, and archaeologists cannot simply project later legal ideas backward. Still, long-term structures make exclusive use easier to imagine. A family that invests substantial labor in maintaining a dwelling may develop stronger claims to that space than a mobile family has over a temporary campsite. The first walls may therefore divide not only weather from people, but people from one another. Sanitation becomes another quiet challenge. Mobile groups often leave waste behind when they move. Permanent communities cannot. Ash animal bones, discarded food, broken tools, human waste, and decomposing organic matter accumulate near houses. Insects and rodents are attracted to stored food. Dogs, already associated with humans in many regions, long before farming move among settlements. Close contact between people-animals, parasites and refuse creates biological conditions different from those experienced by smaller, more dispersed groups. Disease does not suddenly explode into the great epidemics of later cities because populations are still relatively small. But the ecological foundation for future problems is beginning to form. Permanence concentrates bodies. So does conflict. In mobile societies, disputes can sometimes be resolved by separation. A household may leave, a group may split. Sedentary communities reduce that flexibility because houses stored food graves, and local resources make departure costly. People must develop stronger mechanisms for cooperation, negotiation, ritual authority, or social pressure. Violence certainly existed among mobile peoples, and there is no simple progression from peace to conflict. But settled life creates new forms of tension precisely because people cannot easily escape one another. There are benefits powerful enough to offset these costs. Children can be raised without constant long-distance travel. Heavy tools become practical. Food processing can occur on a larger scale. Structures can protect stored goods. Older or injured individuals may find settled environments easier to navigate than repeated migrations. Social gatherings can become larger and more predictable. Craft knowledge can deepen because tools and raw materials can accumulate in one place. The settlement also becomes an information system. People remember where resources are stored, where relatives are buried, which house belongs to which family, who repaired a wall, who contributed food, and who failed to do so. The physical village records social relationships even without writing. Architecture becomes memory made visible. Perhaps the most profound change is psychological, though this is naturally harder to measure archaeologically. For a highly mobile community, home may be a territory, a network of roots, or a seasonal cycle. For increasingly settled groups, home begins concentrating in one location. Children are born beside walls their parents built. They learn the same paths from doorway to hearth, from settlement edge to spring, from house to burial ground. A place becomes familiar not for days but for decades. Once this attachment exists, abandoning the settlement is no longer simply moving camp. It can mean leaving behind labor-food ancestors, identity, and memory. And that helps explain why the next transformation becomes possible. People are not yet farmers in the full sense, but they are already behaving as if particular landscapes belong to their future. Once humans begin expecting to remain, manipulating the plants growing around them becomes less a radical invention than a logical extension of staying home. Long before the first true farms spread across the landscape, people are already living in ways that older theories once assumed agriculture had to create. They are building substantial houses, burying relatives close to home, processing large quantities of wild plants, exchanging materials across long distances, and returning again and again to the same settlements. This creates one of the most important reversals in the story of early civilization. For much of the 20th century, the sequence seemed straightforward. Agriculture produces surplus allows permanent villages grow larger, and complexity follows. Archaeology has made that picture far less tidy. In parts of Southwest Asia, elements of settled life emerge before fully domesticated crops become the foundation of subsistence. The village in some cases comes first. Farming follows. This matters because it changes the meaning of the agricultural revolution. People do not necessarily invent cultivation because they suddenly discover that plants can be grown. Hunter-gatherers already understand plant cycles with extraordinary precision. They know where seeds appear when they ripen, how rainfall changes abundance, which soils favor particular species, and how fire or disturbance can alter vegetation. What begins to change is the intensity of that relationship. A community staying in one place can repeatedly harvest the same stands of wild cereal. It can clear competing vegetation. It can carry seeds closer to the settlement. It can disturb soil in ways that favor edible plants. None of these actions alone creates agriculture, but together they can push humans and plants into a new form of dependence. The Natufian world offers an important glimpse of this transition. People use sickle blades whose edges can develop a distinctive sheen from cutting silica-rich grasses. They grind seeds with heavy stone equipment. They live in settlements containing architecture substantial enough to imply repeated occupation. Yet the cereals they consume are largely wild forms. The distinction is crucial. A wild cereal naturally disperses its seeds when ripe. Its seed head breaks apart easily, allowing reproduction without human assistance. A fully domesticated cereal evolves differently because human harvesting begins favoring plants whose seeds remain attached long enough to be gathered. The process takes generations. Imagine a field of wild grain near a settlement. People cut stalks before all the seeds scatter. Plants with tougher seed attachments are disproportionately collected. Their seeds enter human stores. Some are eaten, some fall near houses, some are eventually planted deliberately. Over repeated harvest cycles, the genetic balance can gradually shift. The plants best suited to natural dispersal become less useful to humans, while plants with traits convenient for harvesting become more common in cultivated populations. No one needs to understand genetics for domestication to occur. Human behavior becomes the selective pressure. Archaeologists can sometimes identify this process through tiny botanical remains. Charred seeds recovered from ancient hearths and storage pits preserve characteristics of plants used thousands of years ago. The shape of the grain, the structure connecting it to the stalk, and changes in seed size can reveal gradual domestication. These remains are often unimpressive to look at. A few blackened fragments of wheat or barley can appear trivial beside monumental ruins. Yet they record a transformation far more consequential than most monuments. They show humans changing the evolutionary future of another species. The earliest cultivation may also be difficult to recognize because farming begins before plants become visibly domesticated. People can sow wild cereals while those cereals still retain wild characteristics. This creates what some researchers describe as a long period of pre-domestication cultivation. Communities may tend crops for centuries, while archaeological plant remains continue looking largely wild. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate exactly how early deliberate cultivation begins at particular sites. But the broad picture increasingly favors a long transition, rather than an instant discovery. The Younger Dryas Cold period may play a role in this experimentation. Around 12,900 years ago, changing climate conditions affect parts of the eastern Mediterranean. Some wild food resources become less predictable in certain areas. Communities accustomed to relatively rich local environments may respond by intensifying the management of plants. Yet the old explanation that climate crisis simply forces humans to invent agriculture is too simple. Some communities become more mobile. Others continue hunting and gathering successfully. Early cultivation develops unevenly. and no single environmental trigger explains every case. Social pressure may be equally important. Settlements contain growing networks of obligation. Food is not merely calories. It can be shared at gatherings, used in ceremonies exchanged between families, or presented during events that strengthen alliances. Producing more food may therefore offer social advantages beyond preventing starvation. Feasting has been proposed as one possible driver of intensified production in some prehistoric societies. The idea remains debated, but it highlights an important point: people may cultivate plants not because they are desperate, but because settled communities create new reasons to produce abundance. One surprisingly early clue comes from evidence suggesting that people in Southwest Asia may have produced fermented beverages before or near the beginnings of agriculture. At Natufian-associated sites, residues and grinding installations have been interpreted by some researchers as evidence for beer-like fermentation using wild cereals. The interpretation is still discussed, and the scale of production is uncertain. But if correct, it suggests that grain may have been valued not only as porridge or bread-like food, but also for ritual or social consumption. The road to farming may have passed through celebrations as well as hunger. Bread itself appears before fully established agriculture. At a site in northeastern Jordan, archaeologists have identified charred remains, interpreted as flatbread-like products, dating to roughly 14,000 years ago, made by hunter-gatherers from wild cereals and other plants. Producing such food requires gathering, grinding, mixing, and cooking ingredients through several labor-intensive stages. It is an astonishing amount of effort for something that disappears in minutes. The implication is that prehistoric diets can be far more technically elaborate than simple images of roasted meat around a fire suggest. These experiments accumulate. A community that invests labor in gathering and processing wild grain has reasons to protect access to productive stands. If those stands are cultivated, the investment increases. Once seed is placed deliberately in the ground, the future harvest depends on staying nearby or returning at the correct time. Human movement begins adapting to plant schedules. What initially looks like humans controlling plants becomes a mutual trap of dependence. Fields demand attention. They can be damaged by animals. Weeds compete with crops. Harvest must occur during narrow windows. Seed for the following year must be protected rather than eaten during hunger. A community that relies increasingly on cultivated grain cannot simply leave when local conditions become inconvenient. The plants have fixed their calendar to a location. Agriculture also changes the scale of labor. Wild gathering spreads effort across multiple resources and seasons. Cultivation concentrates certain tasks. Land must be cleared. Soil may need preparation. Seeds must be sown. Crops must be monitored, harvested, transported, threshed, winnowed, ground, stored, and defended. Many of these activities are repetitive. Skeletal evidence from later farming communities sometimes reveals physical stress associated with heavy workloads and repetitive motions. Farming creates food surpluses, but it does not necessarily make individual lives easier. Nutrition can become narrower as well. Hunter-gatherers with access to diverse ecosystems often consume many plant and animal species. Early farmers can become heavily dependent on a few staples. Cereals provide abundant calories, but do not automatically provide balanced nutrition. Dental problems often become more common with diets rich in carbohydrates. Population density and close contact with animals create new disease risks. By several measures, some early farming communities are less healthy than their hunter-gatherer predecessors. Why continue? Because agriculture can support something mobility usually cannot: more people living in less space. A field may demand enormous effort, but it can yield concentrated calories that can be stored. Grain can survive months under proper conditions. A settlement with stored food can support larger populations through seasons when wild resources are scarce. Even if individuals work harder, the community can grow. Once that population growth begins, returning to the older way of life becomes increasingly difficult. A landscape capable of supporting a small mobile population through hunting and gathering may not support a much larger farming population if cultivation suddenly stops. Agriculture creates the demographic conditions that make agriculture increasingly necessary. This may be one of the deepest ironies of the transformation. The first cultivators probably do not imagine they are creating a permanent new economic system. They are experimenting with familiar plants, managing risk, producing preferred foods, and investing in places where they already live. Yet each successful harvest encourages deeper investment. Storage grows, population increases, fields expand. Knowledge becomes specialized. What begins as a supplement gradually becomes dependence. Human beings have started reshaping the reproductive lives of plants, but the plants are quietly reshaping human society in return. The fields are only part of the transformation. Around the edges of settlements, another relationship is changing just as quietly. Animals that once belong entirely to the wild begin spending more time near people. Some come for scraps, some are hunted selectively, some are captured young. Others are tolerated because they provide warning companionship, meat hides, milk bone, or eventually labor. The process is uneven species by species and region by region, but its consequences are enormous. Human beings are no longer simply hunting animals across the landscape. They are beginning to reorganize animal lives around human settlements, and in doing so they create an entirely new ecological world. Dogs are the great exception because their relationship with humans begins far earlier than agriculture. Descended from ancient wolf populations, dogs are already living alongside people by the end of the Ice Age, and perhaps much earlier. Exactly where and when domestication begins remains debated, partly because early dog and wolf remains can be difficult to distinguish. What survives in the record suggests a long process rather than a single event. Some wolves may have approached human camps to scavenge discarded bones. Individuals less fearful of people would gain access to food. Humans in turn could benefit from animals capable of detecting predators, tracking prey, and eventually assisting in hunting. Over generations, mutual tolerance becomes something deeper. Dogs demonstrate an important principle. Domestication does not have to begin with people deliberately deciding to create a new species. It can start with repeated interactions that favor particular behaviors. The same pattern, though in different forms, later occurs with several animals around early farming settlements. Goats provide one of the clearest examples. Wild bezoar goats live across mountainous regions of Southwest Asia. Early hunters already know them intimately. They understand where herds move when females give birth, and which animals are easiest to capture. Once people settle more permanently, hunting can become management. Instead of killing animals indiscriminately, hunters may increasingly target young males while preserving breeding females. Archaeologists can sometimes detect this through patterns in animal bones. If a site contains unusually high numbers of young male goats, but many older females, the mortality pattern may suggest herd control rather than simple hunting. That distinction is subtle but revolutionary. Keeping females alive allows a population to reproduce under increasingly human influence. Animals may be guided towards certain grazing areas, protected from predators, or prevented from wandering too far. Young animals can become accustomed to human presence. Over generations, physical changes appear as well. domesticated populations often become smaller or develop altered horn shapes compared with their wild ancestors. These changes do not happen immediately, and scholars still debate exactly where management becomes full domestication, but the trajectory is clear. Sheep follow a similar path. Their wild ancestors inhabit parts of the Near East, and early communities begin managing them thousands of years before sheep become the heavily wool-producing animals familiar from later history. At first, meat is likely the primary benefit. Wool becomes increasingly important much later as selective breeding changes the animal's coats. This is easy to forget because modern sheep seem almost designed for textile production. Early domesticated sheep are not. They are the beginning of a biological experiment that later humans will transform repeatedly. Pigs take a different route. Wild boar are opportunistic animals comfortable near human disturbance. Settlements produce refuse food scraps and cultivated plants. Pigs can exploit this environment without requiring the same grazing management as sheep or goats. Their domestication, therefore, appears to involve complex interactions between human-controlled herds and local wild populations. In some regions, domesticated pigs introduced by people later interbreed with wild boar, making their archaeological and genetic history unusually tangled. Cattle carry perhaps the greatest long-term consequences. Their wild ancestor, the aurochs, is a massive and formidable animal, far larger and more dangerous than many modern cattle. Early hunters pursue aurochs for meat, but eventually populations in parts of Southwest Asia are domesticated. This cannot have been a trivial achievement. Managing such powerful animals requires knowledge, patience, social cooperation, and likely generations of selective control. Cattle initially provide meat and hides, but their value eventually expands enormously through milk traction, dung used as fuel or fertilizer, and wealth stored on 4 legs. The first livestock do not immediately transform society into the pastoral landscapes known from later millennia. Early herding remains closely connected to farming and hunting. Wild animals continue to provide food. Herd sizes may be modest. People experiment with different combinations depending on local ecology. Yet animals introduce something plants cannot: mobility inside the food supply. Grain remains where it grows or where it is stored. A goat herd can walk. That mobility opens new landscapes. Areas unsuitable for crops can support grazing animals. Hills, scrublands, and dry zones become economically useful because livestock convert vegetation humans cannot digest into meat and eventually milk. Herding can therefore extend human influence beyond the boundaries of fields. Some communities begin moving animals seasonally between grazing areas, creating forms of pastoral mobility that coexist with permanent settlements. Animals also change the meaning of wealth. Grain can be accumulated, but it must be protected from moisture, insects, rodents, and decay. Livestock reproduce. A herd can grow. It can be exchanged, inherited, slaughtered for ceremonies, transferred between households, or lost suddenly through disease. The ownership of animals may therefore create new opportunities for inequality, though the evidence for early social hierarchy varies greatly between regions and periods. No single explanation fully accounts for when livestock becomes a major measure of status, but in many later societies the connection becomes unmistakable. Daily labor changes as well. Animals must be watched. Predators remain a threat. Herds require water. Sick or injured animals need attention. Breeding must be understood. Young animals may need protection. People must decide when to slaughter and which individuals to preserve. The year becomes organized not only around planting and harvest, but around births, migrations, grazing conditions, and winter fodder. Milk adds another unexpected chapter. Adult humans normally lose much of the ability to digest lactose after childhood, unless they possess genetic variants that maintain lactase production. Early herders do not suddenly acquire these variants because they begin keeping cattle, sheep, or goats. Yet dairy products can still be consumed when milk is processed into forms such as yogurt or cheese, which reduce lactose. Archaeological evidence from pottery residues in later Neolithic contexts shows that dairy use becomes important long before lactase persistence becomes widespread in some populations. Culture changes first. Human biology later evolves partly in response. This interaction between cultural behavior and genetics is one of the most striking consequences of domestication. Humans reshape animals through selection, while living with those animals reshapes humans. The process extends far beyond digestion. Disease is part of the price. Close contact with livestock creates new pathways for pathogens. The enormous epidemics associated with later dense urban societies emerge much later, and it would be misleading to claim that every major disease simply jumps from newly domesticated animals during the earliest Neolithic. Disease histories are far more complex. Still, keeping large numbers of animals near houses changes the microbial environment. Dung accumulates, parasites spread, water can become contaminated. Humans breathe, eat, and sleep in close proximity to species that once remained at a distance. The settlement becomes biologically crowded, yet the benefits are too powerful to ignore. Animal bone becomes tools, hides become clothing and coverings. Horn can be shaped into useful objects. Dung burns where wood is scarce. Meat can be stored on a living animal until needed. Herds provide insurance against poor harvests, although drought or disease can destroy them with equal efficiency. Eventually, animals will pull plows, drag sledges, carry burdens, transport people, and transform warfare. But none of that needs to be visible yet. At this early stage, the change is more intimate. A goat gives birth beside a settlement instead of on a distant hillside. A pig roots through refuse near a house. A dog sleeps close to a hearth. A family chooses not to kill a young female because she may produce offspring next year. The boundary between wilderness and settlement grows thinner with every generation. Humans are building a new world, but they are not building it alone. As fields spread and herds gather near houses, the settlement itself begins to change shape. What had once been a cluster of dwellings occupied by a relatively small community can grow into something much denser, more permanent and socially complicated. Walls are rebuilt over earlier walls. Floors accumulate layers of plaster ash and debris. Storage spaces multiply. Paths become established. Refuse piles grow. People are born, work, eat, become ill, die, and are buried within landscapes increasingly shaped by human hands. The village is no longer simply a place where people happen to live. It becomes an environment in its own right, with its own rhythms, hazards, memories, and forms of organization. Jericho offers one of the most famous examples. Near a powerful spring in the Jordan Valley, people establish a substantial settlement very early in the Neolithic. The location is unusually favorable. Water is reliable in an otherwise demanding environment, and the surrounding landscape offers access to several ecological zones. Over time, houses become closely packed, and the settlement develops large communal structures. Among them is a remarkable stone tower built thousands of years before the pyramids of Egypt. It rises roughly 8 meters high and contains an internal staircase. Nearby are substantial stone walls whose original purpose remains debated. For generations, those walls were often described as defensive fortifications, evidence that warfare had already forced villagers to protect themselves behind barriers. That explanation remains possible, but it is no longer the only one. Some researchers have suggested the walls may have helped control floodwater, or served several functions at once. The tower is even more mysterious. It may have had practical, communal, symbolic, or ritual significance. No single explanation fully accounts for it. What is certain is that constructing such features requires organized labor far beyond the needs of a single household. That is the important clue. Someone has to quarry stone, transport it, shape it, and place it. Workers must be fed while they are doing this. Decisions must be made about design and location. People must agree willingly or otherwise that communal labor is worth the effort. None of this proves the existence of kings, priests, or centralized government. Early villages can organize large projects through kinship, ritual obligations, temporary leadership, or collective decision-making. But the scale of construction shows that human cooperation is becoming capable of producing structures with no immediate connection to one family's survival. The settlement starts to possess needs of its own. Far to the north and west, other communities experiment with different forms of density. Thousands of years after the first occupations at Jericho, Çatalhöyük grows on the Anatolian plain into one of the most extraordinary large settlements of the Neolithic world. It does not resemble a later city with broad streets, public squares, palaces, and administrative buildings. Instead, houses are packed tightly together, wall against wall, creating a dense mass of mud brick architecture. In many areas, there are few or no conventional streets between them. People appear to have entered houses through openings in the roof, moving across rooftops as part of everyday circulation. The result must have been visually striking. From a distance, the settlement may have appeared less like a town divided into buildings and more like an artificial hill made of interconnected homes. Smoke rises from hearths. People cross roofs carrying food tools, baskets, fuel, and building material. Below them, interiors are repeatedly cleaned, plastered, decorated, repaired, and rebuilt. Houses can contain platforms used for sleeping or domestic activity, storage areas, ovens, and burials beneath floors. The dead remain literally beneath the living. At Çatalhöyük, people frequently bury relatives under house floors and platforms. Some buildings accumulate multiple burials over time. This practice creates an intimate relationship between household space and ancestry. A family may sleep above the remains of people who lived there generations earlier. The precise beliefs surrounding these burials cannot be recovered with certainty, and scholars still debate whether particular houses held special ritual importance. But the architecture suggests that domestic life and symbolic life are deeply intertwined. Wall paintings, modelled features, animal remains, and installations appear in some houses. Earlier interpretations sometimes divided buildings into ordinary residences and special shrines, but more recent work has emphasized how difficult that distinction can be. Ritual activities may occur inside normal domestic spaces rather than in separate temples. This is important because it challenges another familiar assumption that complex religion requires formal religious buildings. In early settlements, cooking, burial, ritual memory, and household identity can occupy the same rooms. Çatalhöyük also reveals the increasingly specialized activities made possible by dense settlement. People work obsidian imported or obtained from volcanic sources in central Anatolia. They shape bone, stone, clay, wood, and plant fibers into tools and objects. Some individuals may become especially skilled at particular crafts, although it is difficult to determine whether they work as full-time specialists. In a small mobile group, nearly everyone may need broad competence in many tasks. In a large settlement, repeated practice can allow certain people to become exceptionally good at narrower forms of production. Specialization encourages exchange. A skilled stoneworker may produce more blades than a household needs. Another household may control livestock, grain, or access to valued materials. Networks of reciprocity grow more complicated. Goods move between homes. Obligations accumulate. Social relationships become increasingly embedded in material things. Yet these settlements do not necessarily display the dramatic inequality seen in later kingdoms. Çatalhöyük, for example, lacks obvious palaces or enormous elite tombs from much of its occupation. Houses vary, but not in the extreme way seen in later hierarchical cities. This has led some researchers to argue that large populations can live together for long periods without rigid, centralized authority or a powerful ruling class. The evidence remains incomplete, and differences in status may have existed in ways that archaeology cannot easily detect. Still, early settlement growth is clearly not a simple straight line toward kingship. Population density does, however, create practical challenges that no ideology can ignore. Fuel must be gathered in increasing quantities. Animals consume vegetation around the settlement. Timber is needed for construction. Clay and water must be collected. Fields closest to houses may become exhausted unless soil fertility is maintained. Hunting pressure can reduce nearby wild populations. As the settlement grows, people may have to travel farther for resources that were once close. The environment around a long-lived village therefore begins developing a human signature. Trees are cut, paths are worn, dung accumulates, fields expand. Weeds associated with disturbed soils become more common. Grazing alters vegetation. Rodents flourish in stored grain. The settlement becomes surrounded by an ecological halo created by continuous human use. Inside the houses, air quality can be poor. Hearth smoke fills enclosed spaces. Repeated exposure may affect lungs and eyes. Crowded living conditions assist parasites. Floors have to be replastered. Roofs leak. Walls crack. Houses burn accidentally. When structures are abandoned, new ones may be built directly above them, gradually creating the artificial mounds known in parts of the Near East as tells. A tell is history turned into geology. Every rebuilding raises the settlement slightly. A collapsed wall becomes the foundation of another house. A hearth disappears beneath a floor. A storage pit is filled with rubbish and forgotten. Century after century, the village grows upward from its own remains. Archaeologists, thousands of years later, excavate these layers in reverse, moving downward through generations of ordinary decisions. This accumulated architecture reveals something profound. Humans are no longer merely adapting their shelters to the natural landscape. They are creating landscapes that future humans must adapt to. A child born into one of these large villages enters a world of walls, inherited rooms, established pathways, cultivated fields, managed animals, graves, storage systems, and social obligations that existed before that child was born. The world is beginning to feel permanent, and permanence allows human communities to imagine projects far larger than the house, the field, or even the village itself. The larger the settlement becomes, the more difficult it is to pretend that everyone is still living according to the social logic of a small mobile band. Hundreds of people cannot simply rely on memory, kinship, and informal cooperation in exactly the same way as a group of a few dozen. Resources are more concentrated. Disputes carry greater consequences. Work becomes less evenly distributed. Some households accumulate better access to storage animals, craft knowledge, or exchange networks. Others depend more heavily on what the community can provide. The village is still far from a state, but it has begun generating problems that only exist because people have succeeded in living together at scale. One of the most visible consequences is organization. Large communal buildings, defensive or flood control walls, shared storage areas, and repeated rebuilding projects require coordinated labor. That coordination does not automatically imply rulers. Archaeology offers many examples of communities capable of collective construction, without clear evidence for kings or bureaucracies. Leadership can be temporary ritual, household-based, age-based, or distributed among several respected individuals. What matters is that social cooperation becomes increasingly formalized because the cost of failure is higher. A collapsed roof affects one family. A failed irrigation channel can affect an entire neighborhood. A dispute over grazing land can divide several households. A spoiled communal store can threaten hundreds of people. As settlements grow, problems become interconnected. Food is at the center of nearly all of them. A farming village must balance immediate hunger against future survival. Grain consumed during winter cannot be planted in spring. Seed grain must therefore be protected even when families are hungry. Herds present the same tension. Slaughter too many breeding females and there will be fewer animals next year. Preserve too many animals and the herd may consume pasture needed for future seasons. Every decision links the present to the future. This creates opportunities for authority. Someone who controls storage controls timing. Someone who knows when to open a communal store, redistribute grain, or organize a harvest can become socially important. Yet the archaeological evidence for centralized control in early Neolithic villages remains mixed. Some settlements contain household storage rather than massive central granaries, suggesting that families retain significant economic independence. Others provide hints of communal management. The record does not reveal one universal path. That diversity is important because early communities are experimenting with many different ways of being settled. Civilization does not emerge from a single blueprint. In some places, houses remain similar in size, implying relatively limited economic inequality. In others, variation becomes more pronounced. Certain burials contain unusual ornaments or prestigious materials. Some individuals may have greater access to exotic goods. Obsidian marine shells, colored stone pigments, and finely crafted objects can signal participation in distant exchange networks. But prestige does not always equal political power. A respected craft worker, ritual specialist, successful hunter, healer, or elder may possess social influence without controlling land or food. The distinction between influence and formal authority is almost impossible to reconstruct completely from ancient ruins. Archaeologists find objects, structures, skeletons, and residues, not arguments around hearths or decisions made during bad harvests. Scholars still debate how hierarchical many early settlements really are. The temptation is to read later institutions backward and assume that every large building requires a chief, every rich burial a ruling elite, and every monument a priesthood. The evidence does not always support that certainty. What it does support is increasing differentiation. The division of labor becomes more visible as communities expand. Some people spend more time herding, others work fields. Some become particularly skilled at shaping obsidian, making baskets, building houses, grinding pigments, producing beads, repairing tools, or processing hides. Even if most adults remain capable of many tasks, repeated specialization creates differences in knowledge and dependence. The better one person becomes at a narrow skill, the more that person may rely on others for food or materials. That dependence is one of the foundations of complex society. A highly self-sufficient household can leave a community with relatively little disruption. A household embedded in a web of specialized exchange has more to lose. The potter needs fuel and clay. The farmer needs cutting tools. The herder needs grain. The stoneworker needs food. Exchange binds people together not simply through friendship or kinship, but through necessity. Pottery eventually intensifies this process in many regions. Early sedentary communities can exist for long periods without ceramics, using baskets, skins, wooden containers, stone vessels or pits for storage. When fired, clay vessels become common, however they transform daily life. Pots can boil foods that are otherwise difficult to digest, store liquids, process dairy products, transport grain and preserve food in more controlled ways. Broken pottery also becomes one of archaeology's most useful tools because styles change over time and spread through communities, allowing researchers to track interaction and chronology. Yet pottery is not merely practical. Decoration, shape and manufacturing technique can communicate identity. A vessel may indicate household tradition or regional connection. Objects begin carrying social information as well as food. Clothing and personal ornaments serve similar roles. Beads made from shell or stone require time-raw materials and often long-distance exchange. A necklace can therefore contain a map of relationships. The wearer carries evidence of contact stretching far beyond the village. At some prehistoric sites, shells from distant seas appear hundreds of kilometers inland. These materials could travel through direct journeys or pass from group to group across exchange networks. Either way, they show that early settled communities are not isolated islands. Such networks may also help people survive disaster. A village suffering crop failure can call on relatives or exchange partners elsewhere. Marriage between communities strengthens these connections. Information about rainfall, animal movement, crop varieties, or new technologies can travel alongside objects. Social networks become a form of insurance. But networks also spread conflict, disease, and competition. A desirable resource can become worth controlling. Obsidian sources are especially revealing because the volcanic glass is excellent for producing sharp cutting edges and can often be traced geochemically to specific geological sources. When obsidian from one volcanic region appears far away, archaeologists can reconstruct remarkable patterns of movement. Some settlements sit near valuable resources and may gain importance because of their location. Control of exchange routes can therefore create new forms of influence. Still, trade in this period should not be imagined as caravans of professional merchants negotiating prices in marketplaces. Much exchange probably occurs through kinship, gift-giving, seasonal gatherings, reciprocal obligations, or down-the-line movement between neighboring communities. The boundary between trade diplomacy, ritual, and social bonding is likely much less distinct than in later commercial economies. Gatherings may be particularly important. People from dispersed settlements can meet periodically to exchange partners, materials, stories, foods, and ritual practices. Such events reinforce identities larger than a single village. They also require hosts to feed visitors. Producing surplus may therefore serve not only survival but reputation. A household capable of sponsoring a large feast can gain prestige. Animals can be slaughtered publicly. Grain can be transformed into special foods or fermented beverages. Rare objects can be displayed. Social debts are created. The remains of feasting sometimes appear archaeologically as unusually large concentrations of animal bones serving vessels or food debris, although interpreting such deposits is difficult. These activities introduce a subtle shift. Food becomes power not only because it prevents starvation, but because giving it away can create obligation. The paradox runs through many early societies. Generosity and inequality can grow together. A person who distributes surplus may appear generous while also demonstrating control over resources. A household that repeatedly hosts communal events can become central to village life. Over generations, prestige may become inherited, transformed into authority, or disappear entirely if circumstances change. There is no inevitable path to hierarchy. Some communities seem to resist strong inequality for centuries. Houses are rebuilt to similar scales. Prestige objects circulate rather than concentrating permanently. Leadership may remain temporary or situational. Archaeologists increasingly recognize that humans are capable not only of creating hierarchy, but also of limiting it. Early settled societies may experiment with political arrangements, just as they experiment with crops and livestock. That possibility complicates the familiar story in which villages naturally become chiefdoms and chiefdoms naturally become states. History is less orderly. Settlements grow, fragment, move, collapse, or reorganize. Some large communities remain relatively egalitarian. Others develop pronounced status differences. Some monumental sites appear without clear urban centers. Some early towns flourish for centuries and then disappear. What these settlements share is not a political destination but a new condition. People are trapped productively and dangerously inside networks of mutual dependence. They need one another more than ever. And once a community reaches that point, building something enormous together is no longer impossible. It may even become necessary. Long before kings command armies or scribes record taxes, people begin moving stones that no household could possibly need. On a limestone ridge in southeastern Anatolia, groups gather to quarry enormous pillars, shape them with stone tools, drag them into position, and arrange them inside circular and oval enclosures. Some pillars stand several meters tall and weigh many tons. Their surfaces carry carved animals, snakes, foxes, wild boar birds, insects, and dangerous creatures rendered with an economy of line that makes them seem almost alive. The site is known today as Göbekli Tepe, and when its true age became clear, it forced archaeologists to reconsider one of the oldest assumptions about how civilization begins. Monumental construction appears here around the 10th millennium BCE, at a time when the communities responsible are still heavily dependent on hunting and gathering, and before fully developed village farming dominates the region. The discovery does not mean that agriculture suddenly becomes irrelevant to the story. Nor does it prove that a lost advanced civilization existed before known history, despite popular claims that sometimes attach themselves to spectacular prehistoric sites. The builders used stone tools and materials available to Neolithic communities. There's no evidence of unknown machinery, vanished high technology, or a forgotten urban empire. What is remarkable is already enough people living before cities can organize labor on a scale once thought possible only after agriculture produces large surpluses and centralized leadership. Göbekli Tepe therefore reverses a familiar sequence. The older model imagines farmers first producing surplus food, permanent villages becoming wealthy, and then priests or rulers directing that wealth toward temples. Here, monumental ritual architecture seems to emerge alongside and perhaps partly before the full agricultural transformation. This raises a provocative possibility. Instead of complex ritual being a consequence of settled life, communal ritual may help drive people towards settlement. The idea is still debated. The people who gather at Göbekli Tepe need food. Large numbers of workers cannot quarry and transport stone while simultaneously roaming widely in search of every meal. Hunting must be coordinated. Wild cereals and other plants must be gathered and processed. Water must be available. Seasonal gatherings may require stores of food or intensive harvesting from the surrounding region. The monuments themselves could therefore create pressure for greater organization and food production. If communities return repeatedly to the same ceremonial location, they develop reasons to manage nearby resources more intensively. Wild grain stands become more important. Storage becomes useful. Hunting grounds must support larger gatherings. People who once moved through a landscape according to natural abundance may begin altering that abundance to support events they consider socially or ritually essential. This does not mean a temple invents agriculture in a single stroke. Domestication is occurring through long, complicated processes across several parts of Southwest Asia. But Göbekli Tepe shows that ideology, ritual, and collective identity may belong near the beginning of the story rather than at its end. Even the pillars themselves suggest a social world far richer than simple survival. Many are shaped like stylized human figures. Some have carved arms running down their sides and hands resting near the front. Belts and other details appear on certain examples. The large central pillars in some enclosures seem to represent anthropomorphic beings, though who or what they signify remains unknown. They may represent ancestors, mythic figures, supernatural beings, or symbolic persons whose meaning cannot now be recovered. There is no writing to explain them. That silence is part of the mystery. Archaeologists can document the architecture with extraordinary precision, identify animal species carved into stone study. Tool marks date organic material associated with construction and analyze the surrounding settlement evidence. But the meaning of the images survives only indirectly. A fox may be a fox, a clan emblem, a dangerous spirit, a mythological character, or several of these things at once. Scholars still debate how the enclosures were used, who participated in their construction, and whether access was restricted or communal. Nearby discoveries have made the picture even more complex. Göbekli Tepe is not isolated. Other sites in the region, including Karahan Tepe and several locations sometimes discussed as part of the broader Taş Tepeler landscape, contain monumental stone architecture and related symbolic traditions. These finds suggest a regional phenomenon rather than one inexplicable sanctuary standing alone. Communities across Upper Mesopotamia are experimenting with new forms of gathering architecture, symbolism, and settlement during the transition into the Neolithic. Karahan Tepe has produced structures carved partly into bedrock standing pillars and unusual sculptural elements. As excavation continues, interpretations may change, which is a reminder of how incomplete the evidence remains. Archaeology in this region is still uncovering sites that can alter broader theories about the period. What seemed exceptional a few decades ago may eventually prove to be one expression of a larger cultural system. The labor behind such monuments is as revealing as the symbolism. A massive pillar must first be recognized within the bedrock, outlined, cut free, shaped, and transported. Without metal tools, the process requires enormous patience. Workers use stone hammers and other implements to strike, scrape, and detach limestone. Moving the finished pillar involves coordinated human effort, perhaps ropes, wooden supports, sledges, or techniques that leave little archaeological trace. Exact methods remain uncertain, but no extraordinary technology is required. The extraordinary element is cooperation. Cooperation itself can become a source of identity. People who work together on a monument do more than build stone walls. They create shared memory. Participants remember who contributed labor, who organized food, which families arrived from distant settlements, and which ceremonies accompanied construction. Children grow up seeing structures built by parents and grandparents. The monument becomes proof that the community is larger than any individual household. Feasting may help sustain such gatherings. At Göbekli Tepe, large quantities of wild animal bones have been recovered, including remains of gazelle and other species. Evidence of extensive food processing has encouraged interpretations involving communal meals. Stone vessels and installations at Neolithic sites in the wider region have also contributed to debates over the preparation of fermented cereal drinks. None of this proves that every enclosure functions as a festival center, but food ritual and collective labor likely intersect in important ways. A feast can solve a practical social problem. Monumental construction demands effort from people who could otherwise be hunting, gathering, repairing houses, or tending children. Shared food transforms labor into an event. It creates obligation, prestige, memory. and perhaps competition between groups. The person or household capable of providing more food may gain influence. The group that contributes more labor may strengthen claims to a particular monument or territory. Ritual can therefore organize economics without being reducible to economics. That distinction matters. Humans do not build only because structures are useful in the narrow sense. They build because places can become sacred, ancestral, politically meaningful, or emotionally necessary. A monument may consume resources without producing calories, yet it can bind people together strongly enough to reshape how those calories are produced. Eventually, some enclosures at Göbekli Tepe are deliberately filled in. Stone pillars disappear beneath layers of rubble, sediment, animal bone, and debris. Why this happens remains uncertain. Structures may have been ceremonially closed, replaced, rebuilt, or simply buried as the site changes. The deliberate nature of at least some filling suggests that abandonment is not always accidental. Even the end of a monument can be organized. The broader implication reaches far beyond one hill. Human beings may have begun constructing social worlds before they had fully constructed agricultural ones. Shared beliefs, collective ceremonies, and memories tied to particular places could encourage people to gather repeatedly, cooperate with strangers, and invest labor in landscapes they might once have passed through. The first great monuments are therefore not merely products of civilization, they may be part of the machinery that creates it. The same walls that make life safer also trap people inside new dangers. As settlements grow larger and more permanent, humans begin living in conditions their bodies have rarely experienced before. Houses cluster together, smoke lingers over roofs, refuse accumulates close to sleeping areas, grain stores attract insects and rodents, livestock drink from the same water sources used by families, wells, hearths, ovens, pens, workshops, and burial spaces occupy increasingly crowded ground. The village offers security, food storage, cooperation, and continuity, but it also creates an environment where small problems can multiply. The success of settled life produces its own vulnerabilities. Disease is among the most important. In a highly mobile population, small groups frequently disperse across wide territories. Many infectious diseases cannot persist easily when potential hosts are few and constantly moving. Larger settlements change that equation. Hundreds of people living close together create more opportunities for pathogens to circulate. Children are born more frequently in many settled farming populations, creating a constant supply of individuals with little immunity. Human waste contaminates soil and water. Animals bring their own parasites and microbes into close contact with people. It is tempting to imagine the Neolithic as the moment when all later epidemic diseases suddenly appear, but the reality is more complicated. Many famous infections associated with dense cities evolve or spread much later, and identifying ancient pathogens is difficult without preserved DNA. Still, the ecological conditions that make large-scale disease possible are taking shape. The human-built environment becomes a new habitat not only for people, but for organisms that thrive around them. Rodents are especially successful. Stored grain represents an enormous opportunity for mice and rats. Even if early settlements employed dogs traps or careful storage methods, complete protection is almost impossible. Grain lost to pests is more than an inconvenience. A family entering winter with fewer stores may face starvation months later. Insects can destroy seeds reserved for planting. Mold can spoil food. A storage system that appears to guarantee security can fail silently from within. The problem grows as communities become dependent on fewer staple foods. Wild hunter-gatherer diets can vary greatly, but many groups draw nourishment from diverse plants and animals across changing seasons. Agriculture tends to narrow that range. Wheat, barley, pulses, or other staples provide reliable calories, Yet reliance on a small number of crops makes communities vulnerable to failure. If a wild food becomes scarce, another resource may sometimes replace it. If a field crop fails across an entire region, thousands of people may lose the same food simultaneously. Early farmers also pay a biological cost. Skeletal remains from farming societies in several regions frequently show evidence of stress, although patterns vary greatly between populations. Dental cavities can increase when diets become richer in starches and carbohydrates. Grinding grain can introduce tiny particles of stone into flour, accelerating tooth wear. Nutritional deficiencies may become more common when diets narrow. Some skeletons show interruptions in growth that suggest periods of childhood stress or illness. The old assumption that farming automatically improves health has therefore collapsed. In some populations, the transition to agriculture appears to coincide with shorter average stature, greater dental disease, and increased skeletal signs of physiological stress. Scholars still debate how universal these patterns are because health depends on local diets, environment, social conditions, and archaeological preservation. But the broad lesson is clear: producing more food does not necessarily mean producing healthier people. It does, however, support more people. That difference changes everything. A farming community can survive demographic pressures that would force a mobile group to split. More children can be raised close together. Settlements expand even when individual health declines. This creates one of the central paradoxes of early agriculture. A way of life can be biologically demanding for individuals while enormously successful for populations. Crowding creates more than disease. Noise becomes constant. Smoke from domestic hearths settles inside poorly ventilated houses. Fuel must be burned every day for warmth, cooking, craft production, and food processing. In some dense settlements, repeated exposure to smoke may contribute to respiratory problems. Fires themselves are dangerous. Mud brick structures contain timber reeds, baskets, stored grain textiles, and other combustible materials. One overturned lamp or uncontrolled hearth can destroy a house, and tightly packed neighborhoods may allow flames to spread quickly. Waste is another persistent problem. Broken pottery ash, butchered animal remains, spoiled food, dung, and human waste have to go somewhere. Archaeological middens preserve this discarded material in extraordinary quantities. For researchers, such rubbish is invaluable because it reveals diet and daily life. For the people producing it, it represents an endless sanitation problem. Some settlements develop designated dumping areas. Others allow rubbish to accumulate between buildings or in abandoned structures. Dung can be useful as fertilizer, building material, or fuel, but unmanaged animal waste increases contamination. Flies breed in refuse. Parasites move between people and animals. Water sources become vulnerable, especially during dry periods when everyone relies on the same wells or springs. Then there is labor. Agriculture creates a schedule that does not negotiate. Sowing must happen within suitable conditions. Harvest cannot wait indefinitely. Grain must be processed before rain, or spoilage destroys it. Animals require daily attention, whether people are tired, sick, grieving, or injured. The settled landscape can therefore become a machine that demands continuous maintenance. Grinding grain is a particularly revealing burden. Hand processing cereals requires hours of repetitive motion. In some early farming populations, skeletal changes associated with kneeling and repeated upper body strain have been documented. The exact division of labor varies across cultures and cannot always be reconstructed confidently, but many tasks are physically exhausting. Food that appears effortless once stored in a basket represents months of accumulated work. The settlement also creates new forms of interpersonal tension. Houses stand beside one another. Fields have edges. Herds cross paths. Water access matters. Stored food belongs to someone even if concepts of ownership differ from modern property law. A dispute over hunting territory can sometimes be resolved by moving elsewhere. A dispute over a house occupied for generations is harder to escape. Violence therefore appears in some early settled communities, though not everywhere and not at the same intensity. Human remains occasionally show injuries caused by weapons or blunt force. Some sites contain evidence interpreted as episodes of conflict. Defensive architecture appears in later periods more clearly in several regions. Yet there is no simple story in which farming automatically creates warfare. Many communities live for long periods without strong evidence of organized violence, while mobile groups are not universally peaceful. The relationship between settlement, competition, and conflict remains complex. What changes is the number of things worth defending. Stored grain can be stolen. Herds can be driven away. Fields can be damaged. Water can be controlled. Houses and burial grounds carry ancestral significance. A successful settlement becomes an attractive target precisely because it has accumulated resources that mobile societies cannot easily accumulate. Environmental pressure intensifies these tensions. Farming removes vegetation and exposes soil. Repeated cultivation can reduce fertility if fields are not rested or replenished. Herds overgraze land near settlements. Wood-cutting strips nearby vegetation. As local resources decline, people travel farther for timber fuel, pasture, and hunting. The larger the settlement becomes, the greater its ecological footprint. In favorable years, this system can generate remarkable abundance. In bad years, dependence becomes dangerous. Drought can reduce crops and pasture simultaneously. Flooding can destroy fields. Disease can devastate livestock. A pest outbreak can consume stored food. Because many households rely on the same agricultural cycle, failure becomes collective rather than individual. Communities respond with storage exchange networks, diversified crops, herd management, migration, ritual cooperation, and eventually increasingly complex institutions. These strategies reduce risk, but they also make social life more elaborate. Someone must maintain stores. Someone negotiates with neighboring settlements. Someone manages water or organizes labor. Every solution creates another layer of dependence. The first villages, therefore, do not simply solve the uncertainties of prehistoric life. They exchange one kind of uncertainty for another. Humans have finally created places stable enough to remain in for generations. Now they must learn how to survive the consequences of staying. Once food, animals, tools, and houses begin surviving from one generation to the next, human relationships acquire a new weight. A mobile family can possess valued objects, territories, and social rights, but settled life allows wealth to accumulate physically in ways that are easier to preserve, compare, defend, and inherit. A house remains standing after its builder dies. A granary may contain the labor of an entire season. A herd reproduces. A field improved through years of clearing and cultivation becomes more valuable than untouched ground nearby. These resources do not simply make life more secure. They create new questions about who controls them, who receives them, and who is excluded from them. Property is therefore not invented at a single moment. It emerges through many overlapping claims. One household may consider a dwelling theirs because they built it. Another family may claim access to a field because their parents cultivated it. A lineage may associate itself with a burial area used for generations. Herds may be controlled by families while grazing land remains communal. Water may belong to everyone until drought turns access into conflict. The evidence remains incomplete, and archaeologists cannot reconstruct the exact rules of ownership from walls and bones alone, but settled societies increasingly live among resources that can be claimed in durable ways. Architecture makes some of those claims visible. A wall separates one interior from another. A doorway controls access. Storage bins place food within household space. Repairs demonstrate continued investment. When houses are rebuilt repeatedly in the same location, occupation itself may become a statement of continuity. At sites where burials are placed beneath floors, ancestry and residence can become physically linked. The dead beneath a house may strengthen a family's connection to that place, although scholars still debate how directly such practices relate to property. The consequences may be subtle at first. If every household owns roughly similar tools, stores similar quantities of grain and controls comparable numbers of animals, inequality remains limited. But wealth does not stay equal automatically. One family may enjoy several good harvests while another loses crops to disease. One herd may multiply while another is struck by drought. A household with more adult workers can cultivate larger fields. Skilled craftspeople may receive valued goods in exchange for their work. Marriage can join resources. Death can divide them. Luck starts becoming inheritance. That shift is profound because differences created in one generation can survive into the next. A child born into a household with a large herd begins life with advantages unavailable to a child born into a household that owns little. If land animals, stored food, or exchange connections can be inherited, inequality no longer needs to be recreated from zero during every lifetime. This does not mean the first farming villages immediately divide into rich and poor classes. At many early sites, differences between houses remain relatively modest. Monumental elite residences are absent. Graves may contain few possessions. Some communities appear to resist long-term concentrations of wealth for centuries. Researchers have increasingly emphasized that inequality is not an automatic consequence of farming. Social institutions can redistribute surplus enforced sharing, prevent accumulation, or make prestige temporary rather than hereditary. Yet the possibility of durable inequality has arrived. Livestock may be particularly important because animals combine food mobility, reproduction, and visible value. Grain hidden inside a storage room can be difficult for neighbors to measure. A large herd is harder to conceal. Animals can be exchanged during marriage arrangements, used in feasts, slaughtered during ceremonies, or transferred between generations. Their reproductive capacity means wealth can increase without directly expanding cultivated land. Cattle later become especially powerful symbols of status in many societies, but even in early pastoral communities, controlling animals may create social distinctions. A family with many livestock can survive crop failure by slaughtering some animals. It can provide meat at communal gatherings. It can exchange animals for other resources. Wealth provides resilience, and resilience allows wealth to grow. This creates feedback. A household already possessing surplus can take risks that poorer households cannot. It can devote more time to exchange or craft production. It can support specialists. It may establish alliances by giving food or animals. Generosity can increase prestige, but prestige can also reinforce control over resources. A person who repeatedly provides for others during shortages may become indispensable. Power can therefore emerge through assistance. That is one reason early hierarchy is so difficult to identify. Authority does not need to begin as coercion. A respected elder may organize labor because others trust their judgment. A successful household may manage communal stores because it has the resources to do so. A ritual specialist may gain influence by coordinating ceremonies that bind the settlement together. Over time, temporary responsibility can become expected privilege. Burials sometimes provide clues to these changes. In relatively egalitarian communities, grave goods may be sparse or broadly distributed. In other contexts, certain individuals receive unusual ornaments. rare materials or elaborate treatment. Children buried with valuable objects are particularly significant because they may indicate status inherited at birth rather than earned during life. Such evidence becomes clearer in later prehistoric societies, but the roots of inherited distinction likely begin much earlier. The relationship between gender and property also changes in complex ways. Agricultural labor, herding, food processing, childcare, craft production, and household management can become divided according to local social expectations. Skeletal patterns at some sites suggest different habitual workloads between men and women, though these patterns vary and must be interpreted carefully. There is no universal Neolithic gender system. Different communities organize work and inheritance differently. Still, permanence creates stronger incentives to regulate family relationships. If houses, fields, animals, and stores can be inherited descent matters, communities may care more intensely about who belongs to which household or lineage. Marriage becomes not only a personal alliance but potentially a transfer of labor property and social connections. Kinship becomes economic infrastructure. This can strengthen cooperation. Large extended families can pool labor during harvest or construction. Relatives provide support during illness. Herds and stores can be shared within lineages, but kinship can also produce exclusion. Those without strong local connections may possess weaker claims to land or food. Newcomers can be treated differently from families whose ancestors are buried beneath the settlement. Inequality may even begin appearing in diet. Stable isotope studies of ancient skeletons can sometimes reveal differences in the foods consumed by individuals, while burial treatment and location may expose unequal access to resources. The evidence is not always straightforward, and diet can vary for many reasons unrelated to status, but such scientific methods increasingly allow researchers to see distinctions invisible in architecture alone. The old image of the Neolithic village as a simple community of identical farming households is therefore giving way to something more complicated. These are societies negotiating wealth, ancestry, work, obligation, and status without written laws or formal bureaucracy. The negotiations are probably constant. A good harvest must be divided. A herd must be inherited. A house must pass to someone. A marriage joins households. A death opens questions of succession. A drought tests promises of sharing. Every material improvement creates a social decision. This is how complexity grows, not through a sudden invention of class, but through thousands of choices about who receives what. Over generations, some communities develop mechanisms that keep those differences small. Others allow them to widen. Some later produce chiefs, elites, priests, and ruling families. Others take different paths. But once wealth can survive its owner, history itself begins accumulating unevenly. And from that point onward, the world humans are building will never belong to everyone in quite the same way. The farther early communities settle from the raw materials they need, the more important connection becomes. A village can grow, grain-raise animals, shape mud, brick, and gather local wood, but not every landscape contains obsidian, fine flint, marine shell, rare pigments, salt, or high-quality stone. Some of the most valued materials come from places hundreds of kilometers away. Their movement reveals something easy to miss when looking at isolated ruins. The first settled communities are already part of worlds much larger than themselves. Long before roads, coins, caravans, and professional merchants, people are building networks that connect mountains to plains, inland villages to distant coasts, and one cultural region to another. Obsidian is one of the clearest examples because its geological origin can often be identified with remarkable precision. This volcanic glass fractures into exceptionally sharp edges, making it useful for cutting tools, projectile points, and blades. Important sources exist in regions such as Central and Eastern Anatolia, Armenia, and elsewhere around the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Yet obsidian artifacts appear at settlements far from those volcanic landscapes. In some cases, the material travels hundreds of kilometers before being discarded in a house workshop or rubbish deposit. The stone itself becomes a map. Modern chemical analysis can compare trace elements in an artifact with known volcanic sources, allowing archaeologists to reconstruct routes of movement that vanished thousands of years ago. The results show that prehistoric communities are not simply exchanging with their nearest neighbors. Materials sometimes move through extensive chains of interaction. One group may acquire obsidian near its source, carry it to another settlement, and pass part of it onward. After repeated exchanges, a fragment of volcanic glass can end up far from the mountain where it formed. That does not necessarily mean professional traders are walking fixed commercial routes. The economic categories familiar from later history may not apply neatly here. Exchange can occur through marriage, seasonal gatherings, reciprocal gifts, ritual partnerships, kinship obligations, or simple barter. A person traveling to visit relatives may carry stone. A group attending a communal gathering may bring shells or pigment. A household may exchange surplus grain for a tool blank. Trade, friendship, ritual, and diplomacy may overlap so completely that separating them would make little sense to the people involved. Marine shells reveal similar connections. Shell ornaments have been found far inland, sometimes hundreds of kilometers from the coast. Their practical value is limited, but their social value may be considerable. A shell can be shaped into a bead, sewn onto clothing, worn as a necklace, or incorporated into burial decoration. Because it comes from somewhere distant, it carries more than beauty. It signals connection. The farther an object travels, the more stories can accumulate around it. A bead made from a distant shell may represent access to people the wearer has never met. A piece of obsidian can embody relationships stretching across several communities. Rare pigments or stones can become markers of identity or prestige precisely because they are difficult to obtain. The movement of objects therefore creates social geography. People begin understanding the world not only through the land they occupy, but through networks linking them to places beyond the horizon. These networks also carry information. A new method of harvesting grain can spread from one community to another. So can pottery styles, architectural techniques, ritual practices, animal breeds, seed varieties, ornaments, and burial customs. When archaeologists observe similar objects appearing across wide regions, the explanation is rarely simple. People may migrate. Ideas may spread without major population movement. Objects may travel independently of the people who made them. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the relative importance of migration exchange and local imitation in many prehistoric transformations. What is clear is that innovation does not remain local forever. Agriculture itself spreads through a mixture of these processes. In some regions, farming populations moved into new landscapes, bringing domesticated plants and animals with them. In others, local hunter-gatherers adopt crops, livestock, or technologies from neighboring groups. Ancient DNA has made these patterns far clearer in recent years, revealing episodes when population movement plays a major role, and others when cultural exchange is more important. The Neolithic world is not a single expanding culture. It is a patchwork of interaction, migration, adoption, resistance, and mixture. Trade networks make this patchwork more resilient. A village struck by drought may obtain food from relatives elsewhere. A community lacking good stone can acquire tools through exchange. Herds can be moved temporarily toward better pasture. Seeds from another region may prove more suitable after environmental change. Social relationships extending beyond the village provide alternatives when local systems fail. This is an early form of insurance. It works only if relationships are maintained. Gifts must be returned eventually. Marriage ties require visits. Gathering places must remain accessible. Trust must survive disputes. A settlement that consistently refuses to reciprocate may find itself isolated when conditions worsen. Social generosity therefore has practical consequences, yet networks can also create dependence. A village accustomed to receiving obsidian may become vulnerable if exchange routes break down. A community that specializes heavily in one product may rely on outsiders for other necessities. Prestige goods can become tools of competition. Those who control access to rare materials may gain influence. Location begins to matter in new ways. A settlement positioned near a river crossing mountain pass spring or valuable resource can become a natural point of interaction. People moving between ecological zones may stop there repeatedly. Goods accumulate. News arrives. Marriages are arranged. Ritual gatherings become larger. Over generations, places that once held no special political importance can become central simply because geography funnels movement through them. These early hubs are not yet marketplaces in the later urban sense, but they foreshadow them. Salt provides a particularly useful example of how ordinary necessities can shape exchange. Humans and livestock need salt, yet it is unevenly distributed. Natural deposits, saline springs, coastal evaporation zones, and salt-rich sediments can therefore attract long-distance movement. In later prehistoric periods, control over salt becomes economically significant in several regions. The deeper principle is already present. Essential resources create roots, and roots create relationships. The same applies to stone suited for axes. Neolithic farming often requires clearing woodland, especially as agriculture expands into more heavily forested regions. Polished stone axes become crucial tools. Certain geological sources produce particularly durable material, and axes made from such stone can travel extraordinary distances. Some examples may never have been used heavily, suggesting that certain objects acquire ceremonial or symbolic value beyond practical function. An axe can cut a tree, but it can also represent a journey. This combination of practical and symbolic exchange helps explain why prehistoric networks become so durable. People do not move only what they need to survive. They move what they value, what they remember, and what connects them to others. Gatherings probably reinforce these systems. Seasonal meetings allow dispersed groups to exchange food, animals, partners, raw materials, and knowledge. Feasts can transform exchange into obligation. Ritual practices create shared identities across settlements. A person may belong simultaneously to a household, a village, a lineage, and a broader regional tradition. That widening identity is important because the social world is becoming larger than face-to-face daily life. In a small settlement, nearly everyone may be personally known. In a regional exchange network, people must interact with strangers or distant acquaintances. Trust needs new foundations, shared symbols, ritual traditions, styles of clothing, pottery decoration, or common meeting places may help signal belonging. Culture itself becomes part of the infrastructure that allows exchange to function, but the same networks that carry grainstone and ideas can carry danger. Conflict can spread along them. Crop diseases can move with seed. Animal pathogens can travel with livestock. Human infections can follow travelers. A settlement deeply connected to distant communities gains resilience but also exposure. This tension never disappears from civilization. The first villages are beginning to learn that connection creates both security and vulnerability. Isolation protects against some dangers, but leaves communities with fewer options. Networks bring resources and knowledge, but also competition and dependency. For now, the balance is worth it. Across mountains, rivers, plains, and coasts, objects continue moving from hand to hand. No merchant writes down the transaction. No road sign marks the route, no state protects the traveller, and yet piece by piece humanity is already constructing the invisible skeleton of the larger world to come. Not every village survives the world it helps create. Beneath the long story of expanding agriculture and growing settlements lies another history made from abandoned houses, empty fields, burned structures, forgotten wells, and communities that disappear from places occupied for generations. The archaeological record can make the rise of settled life seem almost inevitable, because the successful experiments eventually lead toward towns and cities. But for the people living through these centuries, nothing is guaranteed. Settlements grow and then shrink, communities fragment, fields lose productivity, water shifts, exchange routes weaken, violence sometimes intrudes, disease spreads through crowded households. A village that appears permanent within one lifetime can become ruins within another. The reasons are rarely simple. Environmental change remains one of the most persistent pressures. Farming ties communities to rainfall patterns more tightly than many mobile hunting and gathering strategies do. A dry year is difficult. Several dry years can become catastrophic. Crops fail at the same time that pasture deteriorates. Livestock weaken. Springs produce less water. Families consume seed grain intended for the following season. Stored reserves disappear. A settlement whose population has grown during decades of favorable conditions can suddenly contain more people than the surrounding landscape can support. Yet drought does not automatically destroy a community. People have options. They can plant different crops, move livestock, deepen wells, rely more heavily on wild foods, exchange with neighbouring settlements, reduce consumption, or temporarily migrate. The outcome depends on how severe the environmental stress becomes and how flexible the social system remains. This is why archaeologists increasingly resist explanations that reduce abandonment to a single climate event. The same drought can produce different histories in neighbouring communities. Local environmental damage can intensify the problem. A permanent settlement needs fuel every day. Trees and shrubs are cut for fires, roofing, tools, fences, and construction. Herds graze nearby vegetation. Fields are repeatedly cultivated. If nutrients are not restored or land is not allowed to recover, soil fertility can decline. Erosion may increase after vegetation is removed. People then travel farther for timber pasture and wild resources, increasing the labour required simply to maintain ordinary life. None of this means early farmers are unaware of environmental limits. They possess detailed ecological knowledge and can adapt land use practices over generations. Fields can be rotated, dung can fertilize soil, herds can be moved seasonally. Wild resources remain important, but population growth makes every adjustment more difficult because the settlement must support more people from the same general territory. Success creates pressure. Çatalhöyük illustrates how even a large and long-lived settlement can eventually change dramatically. After centuries of dense occupation, population patterns shift and habitation becomes less concentrated. Researchers have proposed several contributing factors, including environmental pressures, changing farming practices, social tensions, disease, and altered household organization. There is no evidence for one spectacular catastrophe that suddenly destroys the entire community. Instead, the settlement seems to transform over time. That slower kind of disappearance is common in archaeology. A place can cease to exist without being violently destroyed. Families leave gradually. One house is abandoned while another remains occupied. A generation chooses a smaller settlement nearby. Fields shift. Exchange routes move elsewhere. After enough departures, roofs collapse. Rain erodes walls. Weeds grow through rooms where people once slept above their ancestors. To later observers, the result looks like collapse. To those experiencing it, it may have felt like relocation. Jericho also experiences repeated episodes of occupation, abandonment, rebuilding, and transformation across an extraordinarily long history. Its famous early walls do not guarantee permanent continuity. No structure can eliminate environmental change or social instability forever. Permanence, one of the great promises of settled life, is therefore partly an illusion. Humans can build walls that survive generations, but the communities inside them remain vulnerable. Conflict adds another layer. As fields' livestock stored food and water become increasingly valuable, neighboring groups have more concentrated resources to compete over. Archaeological evidence from some prehistoric sites includes traumatic injuries, burned settlements, defensive works, or concentrations of human remains interpreted as episodes of violence. Other settlements show little indication of warfare. The pattern varies enormously across time and geography. This variation matters. Farming does not automatically create organized warfare, just as hunting and gathering does not guarantee peace. Population density, territorial pressure, political organization, environmental stress, and cultural traditions all influence violence. Scholars still debate how common warfare is during different phases of the Neolithic, partly because skeletal injuries can have several causes, and defensive-looking structures can serve other purposes. Even so, the potential rewards of raiding increase in a settled landscape. A successful village contains stored grain that can be carried away. Animals can be stolen and driven elsewhere. Houses contain tools, ornaments, textiles, and food. Fields represent future harvests. A mobile camp may possess valuable objects, but a permanent village concentrates wealth in one predictable location. Security becomes another cost of accumulation. Communities may respond by building walls, locating settlements in defensible positions, strengthening alliances, or organizing larger cooperative groups. These solutions require more labor and coordination, further increasing social complexity. Once again, a problem created partly by settled life encourages institutions that make settlement even more organized. Internal conflict can be equally dangerous. As households accumulate different levels of wealth, disputes over inheritance, access to land, water, or livestock may become harder to resolve. A community capable of coordinating hundreds of people must also prevent those people from fragmenting into hostile factions. Ritual gatherings, communal projects, marriage alliances, feasting, and shared ancestry may help maintain cohesion. But these systems can fail. The physical layout of a settlement may even change as social relationships change. Houses can become more independent. Storage can move from communal spaces into households or in the opposite direction. Neighborhoods can form. Walls can separate groups more clearly. Archaeologists sometimes observe these architectural changes without knowing exactly what political disputes lie behind them. Architecture preserves outcomes, not conversations. Disease may further destabilize communities already under stress. Poor harvests weaken nutrition. Malnutrition increases vulnerability to infection. Crowding assists transmission. Livestock disease can eliminate both food and wealth. A household losing several adults also loses labor needed for planting and harvest, making recovery more difficult. Problems reinforce one another. This is what makes collapse so difficult to explain. Climate disease, conflict, inequality, resource depletion, and migration are often treated as competing theories, but they can operate together. Drought reduces harvests. Scarcity intensifies disputes. Conflict disrupts exchange. Malnutrition increases disease. Death reduces labor. More families leave. The settlement then becomes harder to maintain. No single explanation fully accounts for every abandoned community because collapse is often a chain rather than an event, and abandonment is not necessarily failure. People who leave a struggling settlement carry knowledge with them. They know how to cultivate grain, manage livestock, build houses, make tools, store food, and organize communal labor. They may establish smaller villages elsewhere or join relatives in neighboring regions. Technologies survive even when particular settlements do not. The world being built is therefore remarkably difficult to erase. A village can vanish while the idea of village life spreads. A field can return to scrub while domesticated seed travels elsewhere. A monument can be buried while the social traditions that made collective construction possible continue in another form. This is one reason the Neolithic transformation advances despite repeated local collapses. There is no single center whose destruction can end the experiment. Thousands of communities are trying different combinations of farming, herding, gathering, exchange ritual, and settlement. Some fail, some adapt, some abandon one strategy and adopt another. Humanity is learning through countless experiments whose names are lost, and from the ruins of those experiments, increasingly organized forms of power are beginning to emerge. Power does not arrive wearing a crown. It begins in smaller acts, organizing people to repair a canal, deciding when stored. Grain should be opened, settling a dispute between households, coordinating a communal hunt, directing construction, maintaining relationships with neighboring settlements, or remembering which family owes labor after the last harvest. None of these tasks requires a king. Yet as villages become larger, and their economies more interconnected, temporary acts of coordination can become permanent responsibilities. Responsibilities can become offices. Offices can acquire privileges. Slowly, the authority once distributed through households, elders, ritual specialists, and informal agreements begins taking forms that can outlive the individuals who first exercised it. This transformation is neither universal nor irreversible. Some communities remain relatively decentralized for long periods. Others grow large and then fragment without producing strong centralized institutions. Archaeologists increasingly recognize that human political development does not follow a single ladder from band to tribe to chiefdom to state. Communities can move between more centralized and less centralized arrangements. They can experiment with collective decision-making, hereditary authority, ritual leadership councils, household autonomy, and combinations of these systems. The evidence remains incomplete because political rules leave fewer traces than stone walls, yet certain pressures repeatedly favor organization. Water is one of them. Agriculture in many early regions depends largely on rainfall, but where farming expands into dry environments or onto floodplains, controlling water becomes increasingly important. Channels can divert seasonal flows, embankments can protect fields. Small irrigation works can extend cultivation beyond naturally watered ground. Maintaining these systems requires cooperation because water ignores household boundaries. If one family blocks a channel upstream, another may lose its crop downstream. Rules become necessary. The earliest irrigation systems do not require powerful states, and the once popular idea that large governments simply emerge because rulers are needed to control water is too deterministic. Villages can manage irrigation collectively. Local communities have done so throughout history, but as networks become larger, coordination becomes more demanding. Channels must be cleaned, schedules must be maintained, disputes must be resolved, labor must be mobilized quickly after floods or damage. The landscape becomes infrastructure. This is especially important in Mesopotamia, where later urban civilization develops between and around the Tigris and Euphrates river systems. Southern Mesopotamia offers fertile alluvial soils but lacks many raw materials. timber good building, stone and metal ores are scarce. Rainfall is insufficient for dependable agriculture in much of the south, making irrigation increasingly significant. Yet the region can produce enormous quantities of grain when water is managed effectively. That combination, agricultural potential and resource scarcity, encourages both organization and exchange. Villages established across the alluvial plain begin connecting through waterways. Boats can transport grain and bulky goods more efficiently than people carrying them overland. Rivers and canals become routes as well as water sources. Settlements positioned along them can communicate, exchange goods, and coordinate production across wider territories. The exact geography of the earlier southern settlements is difficult to reconstruct because river channels shift, sediments accumulate, and later occupation covers older remains. Some early sites lie deeply buried beneath alluvium. Archaeologists therefore see only part of the landscape. What survives suggests that by the 6th and 5th millennia, BCE communities associated with traditions such as the Ubaid are developing increasingly substantial settlements across Mesopotamia. Ubaid period communities are especially important because they reveal complexity before true cities dominate the region. Settlements contain distinctive pottery, substantial architecture, agricultural economies, and increasingly broad cultural connections. At places such as Eridu, sequences of buildings later interpreted as temples develop over long periods. Their earliest forms are relatively modest compared with the monumental temples of later Mesopotamia, but rebuilding on the same location creates continuity between communal ritual and emerging institutional power. A building repeatedly reconstructed for generations becomes more than architecture. It becomes an institution. People contribute labor to maintain it. Food may be consumed or redistributed there. Ritual specialists may become associated with it. The building acquires memory independent of any individual household. Its authority comes partly from age previous generations used this place. Therefore, the present generation continues to use it. Institutional continuity solves one of the fundamental problems of large societies. Individuals die. Knowledge must survive them. In a small community, an elder can remember who owes whom, where boundaries lie, or when rituals should occur. As populations expand, memory becomes strained. More fields exist. More households exchange goods. More labor obligations accumulate. More strangers arrive. Eventually, societies develop increasingly formal systems for recording information, though true writing still lies ahead. Before writing, other technologies can help. Clay tokens, sealing stamps, standardized containers, and counting devices appear in various prehistoric contexts, and later become important in systems of administration. Their exact uses change across time and region. A seal pressed into wet clay can identify a person, household, or institution. A sealed container can show whether its contents have been disturbed. Tokens can represent quantities or categories of goods. These humble technologies allow trust to extend beyond face-to-face observation. Administration begins with objects. Standardization becomes another clue. If containers are produced in relatively consistent sizes, quantities become easier to estimate. If weights eventually become standardized, exchange becomes more predictable. If fields are measured, obligations can be calculated. None of these developments is dramatic alone, but together they allow economic relationships to operate across populations too large for everyone to know one another personally. Specialization deepens alongside administration. Some people can spend increasing amounts of time producing pottery, stone tools, textiles, ornaments, boats, or architectural materials because farmers generate food beyond immediate household consumption. Again, this does not mean a sudden appearance of full-time professions. The transition is gradual, but the more specialized production becomes, the more important redistribution and exchange become. A craft specialist cannot eat pottery. Someone must produce the food that supports that labor. Institutions capable of collecting and redistributing surplus therefore gain enormous importance. Grain is particularly suitable because it can be measured, stored, divided, and transported. A central store can feed workers during construction. It can support specialists. It can provide relief during shortage. It can also become a source of political power if access is controlled. The same system that protects a community can create dependence on those administering it. This is where hierarchy begins becoming more visible. Larger buildings appear. Certain settlements become more important than surrounding villages. Ritual and economic authority may overlap. Some households gain greater access to valued materials. Leadership can become less temporary. Yet scholars still debate exactly when these changes should be described as states, chiefdoms, temple institutions, or something else. Modern political categories can impose sharp boundaries on processes that prehistoric people experience gradually. There is no morning when a village suddenly realizes it has become a state. Instead, scale changes. A canal serves several households, then an entire settlement. A storage facility supports a neighborhood, then a larger institution. A ritual building becomes the center of repeated communal investment. A settlement attracts specialists. Smaller villages depend on its exchange networks. Leadership becomes necessary more often and for longer periods. Eventually, some places begin dominating the surrounding landscape. The built environment reflects the shift. Public structures become increasingly distinct from ordinary houses. Labor is concentrated into projects whose scale announces communal or institutional authority. Production occurs in larger quantities. Surplus moves through systems more complicated than direct exchange between neighbors. People are creating organizations that possess their own continuity. A temple can survive generations of priests. A canal can outlast those who dug it. A storage system can function through rules inherited by people who did not invent them. Authority becomes embedded in places, practices, and institutions. That is the threshold between a society organized mainly through personal relationships and one increasingly governed by systems. For thousands of years, humans have been building houses. Now they are beginning to build structures of power that cannot be seen as easily as walls, but will prove far more difficult to escape. By the 4th millennium BCE, the long experiment in settled life begins producing something fundamentally different in southern Mesopotamia. From a distance, the change may first appear to be one of size. Settlements become larger populations, denser buildings more specialized, and cultivated landscapes more extensive. But size alone does not create a city. What emerges is a new form of human organization in which thousands, eventually tens of thousands of people depend on institutions, occupations, exchange networks, and administrative systems extending far beyond individual households. The village has not simply expanded, it has crossed a threshold. Uruk becomes the most famous expression of this transformation. Located in the alluvial landscape of southern Mesopotamia, it develops into an enormous urban center by the later 4th millennium BCE. Estimates of its population and precise size vary, because reconstructing ancient demographics is difficult, but there is little doubt that Uruk reaches a scale extraordinary for its time. Monumental precincts rise above dense habitation. Workshops produce goods in quantities difficult to explain through household consumption alone. Agricultural surplus flows toward the settlement from the surrounding countryside. Raw materials arrive from regions far beyond southern Mesopotamia. For a person whose ancestors lived in villages of a few hundred inhabitants, such a place would represent an entirely new human environment. Most people encountered in the streets are no longer relatives. A worker may eat grain grown by farmers never personally met. A craftsperson may shape stone quarried hundreds of kilometers away. a laborer can contribute to a building whose planners are unknown to them. Trust can no longer depend entirely on face-to-face relationships. Administration fills the gap. Clay becomes one of the quiet foundations of urban life. Southern Mesopotamia lacks abundant timber and stone, but it possesses enormous quantities of riverine mud. Mixed with plant material and dried clay becomes brick. Shaped into containers, it stores goods. Formed into ceilings, it secures doors and vessels. Pressed with carved cylinder seals, it records identity or authority. Eventually, clay becomes the surface upon which administrators make marks, representing quantities, commodities, and transactions. Writing does not appear because someone decides humanity needs literature. Its earliest Mesopotamian forms are closely connected to accounting and administration. By the late 4th millennium, BCE tablets from Uruk contain numerical signs and symbols associated with commodities, labor, and institutional management. The script is still far from the fully developed cuneiform used in later centuries, and many early signs remain difficult to interpret. Yet a decisive boundary has been crossed. Information can now survive outside human memory. A quantity of grain no longer has to be remembered by the person who measured it. A transaction can leave a physical trace. This changes power profoundly. Spoken agreements depend on witnesses and memory. Records allow institutions to accumulate knowledge across time. Administrators can track deliveries, labor, livestock fields, and stored goods. The system is still limited, but it permits coordination on a scale that oral memory alone would struggle to sustain. Cylinder seals add another layer. These small carved objects can be rolled across wet clay, leaving repeated images or designs. Their impressions can mark containers, doors, or administrative documents. A seal functions partly as identity and partly as authority. The individual or institution represented by it does not need to remain physically present for its mark to continue carrying meaning. Authority has become portable. Urban specialization intensifies. Potters produce vessels in large quantities. Textile workers process wool. Metal workers handle imported ores. Builders maintain monumental architecture. Boatmen move goods through rivers and canals. Farmers outside the city generate the food sustaining people who no longer spend most of their lives producing their own calories. The dependence between countryside and city becomes structural. Without rural grain, urban specialists cannot survive. Without administrative and exchange networks, surplus cannot reliably reach them. Without canals and waterways, transport becomes more difficult. Without institutions capable of organizing labor, large public works deteriorate. Civilization begins behaving like a system in which the failure of one part can threaten many others. The famous beveled rim bowl provides a small but revealing glimpse into this world. Thousands of these coarse, standardized clay vessels appear at Uruk period sites. Their exact function remains debated. They may have been used for ration distribution, food preparation, or other institutional purposes. Whatever their precise role, their mass production suggests standardization on a scale rarely seen in earlier household economies. Standardization reduces individuality but increases efficiency. That principle will become central to urban life. The city's monuments reveal the same movement toward institutional scale. Large buildings rise within ceremonial precincts constructed from materials requiring enormous collective labor. Some are decorated with elaborate techniques, including clay cones inserted into walls to create patterned surfaces. Their construction requires planning food for workers' specialized knowledge and access to resources. These are no longer projects that can easily be understood as the work of several cooperating families. Institutions stand behind them. Exactly how Uruk is governed remains uncertain. Later Mesopotamian cities possess kings, temple establishments, officials, and increasingly documented hierarchies, but projecting those later structures directly backward is risky. Scholars still debate the relationship between religious authority, economic administration, household power, and emerging political leadership during the Uruk period. What survives in the record suggests increasing centralization without revealing every mechanism behind it. Long-distance connections expand at the same time. Southern Mesopotamia needs materials unavailable locally: timber, metals, stone, and other resources. Uruk-related material culture appears across parts of northern Mesopotamia, Syria, Anatolia, and Iran. Some sites seem to contain communities strongly connected to southern traditions. Whether these represent colonies, trading enclaves, migrant communities, local imitation, or different combinations remains debated. The important point is scale. Networks that once carried individual pieces of obsidian or shell now move substantial quantities of materials between specialized regions. Boats transport bulky goods along waterways. Pack animals extend overland movement. Settlements become nodes in systems spanning hundreds of kilometers. The world is becoming economically interconnected long before anyone can see its full shape. And with interconnection comes vulnerability. A failed harvest can affect urban food supplies. Political disruption can interrupt raw materials. Canal neglect can reduce agricultural production. Institutions powerful enough to coordinate thousands of people can also extract labor and resources from them. The same administrative system that distributes grain can demand it as an obligation. Inequality becomes harder to avoid. Specialized officials possess access to information. Institutions control storage. Monumental buildings dominate landscapes filled with smaller houses. Labor is increasingly organized beyond the household. By later Mesopotamian periods, hierarchy will become unmistakable in written records, architecture, and burial practices. Yet none of this appears from nowhere. Every urban institution has deep roots in experiments made by earlier communities: the storage pit, the shared building, the seasonal gathering, the exchange network, the cultivated field, the managed herd, the communal monument, the household seal, the obligation remembered between neighbors. The city combines them and magnifies them. That may be the most remarkable thing about the first urban world. There is no single invention called civilization. There is no moment when humans suddenly discover how to build society. Instead, thousands of smaller solutions accumulate until their combination creates something qualitatively new. A person can now be born inside a city containing institutions older than their grandparents, surrounded by strangers performing specialized work, eating food produced beyond sight, obeying rules they did not create, and relying on systems too large for any individual to understand completely. For the first time, humans are not merely living in communities, they are living inside civilization. By the time the first cities rise above the plains of Mesopotamia, the people who began this transformation are already unimaginably distant. Their names are gone. Their languages, except for the faintest indirect traces, have disappeared. No inscription identifies the person who first scattered useful seeds near a settlement, or the family that decided to repair a house rather than move away. No monument records who first learned that preserving particular animals could slowly turn hunting into herding. The great irony of civilization is that its foundations are created largely by people who live before history can remember them individually. The first world builders leave no autobiographies. They leave floors, bones, seeds, tools, graves, walls, and landscapes changed by human hands. Those fragments reveal a transformation that lasts thousands of years rather than a single revolution. Humanity does not wake one morning as hunter-gatherers and go to sleep as farmers. Nor does agriculture automatically produce villages, monuments, inequality, government, and cities in a predictable sequence. The evidence has made that older story increasingly difficult to defend. Some communities become relatively sedentary before farming. Monumental architecture appears among societies still heavily dependent on wild resources. Large settlements can exist without obvious kings. Agriculture spreads through both migration and adoption. Hierarchy emerges strongly in some places while remaining restrained in others. There is no blueprint. Instead, the transformation resembles countless experiments unfolding simultaneously. One community invests in wild cereals. Another becomes increasingly dependent on livestock. Another occupies a rich wetland where hunting and gathering remain productive. Some settlements grow, others deliberately remain small. Some people move into new territories carrying domesticated plants and animals. Others encounter farmers and adopt only selected parts of their way of life. Even after agriculture becomes established, hunting and gathering do not simply disappear. Wild plants, fish game, shellfish, and woodland resources continue supplementing farming economies for millennia. Pastoral communities develop ways of life centered on movement rather than permanent fields. Coastal societies can remain heavily dependent on marine resources. Human history refuses to fit neatly into stages. What changes permanently is the range of possibilities. Before domestication, every human community ultimately depends on ecosystems it does not fully control. Afterward, humans increasingly create the ecosystems on which they depend. Fields replace portions of wild vegetation. Herds concentrate selected species. Irrigation redirects water. Settlements alter soils. Forests are cleared. Useful plants travel beyond their original ranges. The planet begins acquiring a human architecture. This transformation is visible even in the biology of other species. Modern wheat carries the legacy of generations of selection. Domestic sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs are living records of prehistoric choices. Their bodies have been altered because humans repeatedly favored certain traits. In return, these species alter humanity. They influence diets, labor migration, disease exposure, wealth, and eventually human genetics. The partnership is never entirely under human control. A farmer depends on rain, a herder depends on pasture, stored grain depends on protection from moisture and pests. Irrigation can increase yields but may create long-term problems such as soil salinity in certain environments. Dense settlements provide security while concentrating disease. Surplus protects against famine while creating something worth stealing or controlling. Nearly every solution produces another problem. That pattern becomes one of civilization's defining features. More food supports more people, and more people require more food. Irrigation expands production, and expanded production requires canal maintenance. Storage reduces seasonal risk, and stored wealth requires protection. Specialization improves technology, and specialists become dependent on farmers. Exchange provides resources, and communities become vulnerable to disrupted routes. Administration coordinates complexity, and administrators gain power. The systems humans create begin demanding their own maintenance. This may explain why the question of whether civilization represents progress is so difficult. By many measures, settled societies accomplish extraordinary things. They support dense populations, preserve knowledge, develop specialized crafts, construct monumental architecture, and eventually produce writing mathematics, organize medicine, astronomy, literature, and technologies impossible for small dispersed populations to sustain at the same scale. But the transition also brings heavier workloads to many people. Greater exposure to infectious disease, social inequality, organized warfare in some contexts, ecological degradation, and political systems capable of extracting labor on unprecedented scales. There is no honest way to reduce this history to either triumph or mistake. The people living through it do not choose between civilization and some imagined alternative in a single decision. Each generation responds to circumstances inherited from the previous one. Once population grows around farming, Abandoning agriculture becomes difficult. Once canals support thousands of people, maintaining them becomes essential. Once specialists depend on surplus, the economy must keep moving. Choice becomes constrained by previous choices. That may be the deepest legacy of the first settled communities. They create not merely technologies, but systems that shape the options available to future generations. The house makes permanence easier. Permanence encourages storage. Storage supports larger populations. Larger populations intensify cultivation. Cultivation encourages property claims. Property complicates inheritance. Surplus enables specialization. Specialization deepens exchange. Exchange expands administration. Administration strengthens institutions. Institutions make cities possible. None of those steps is inevitable by itself. Together they change the human condition. And still much remains unknown. Archaeologists continue discovering settlements beneath modern towns, alluvial deposits, deserts and seas. Ancient DNA is rewriting migration histories that once depended largely on pottery styles and stone tools. Microscopic residues reveal foods invisible to earlier excavators. Isotope analysis reconstructs movement and diet from human teeth and bones. Sediment cores expose ancient climates. Underwater archaeology is beginning to investigate coastlines submerged when Ice Age seas rose. The story is therefore unfinished. Some of its most important evidence may still lie beneath landscapes that cannot easily be excavated. The continental shelves drowned after the Ice Age once contained enormous territories, attractive to human settlement. Rivers that supported prehistoric communities now lie beneath modern seas. Later cities have buried earlier villages under meters of construction. Agricultural fields have erased shallow sites. Organic materials have decayed completely. For every settlement known, others have vanished without recognizable traces. Yet enough survives to reveal the essential pattern. The first humans who built this new world are not mysterious superhuman engineers. They possess no forgotten machines. They receive no sudden package of knowledge from an unknown civilization. Their achievement is more impressive precisely because it requires none of those things. They have observation. They have memory. They have hands capable of learning complicated movements and minds capable of sharing those movements with others. Most importantly, they have generations. One person discovers a useful technique. Another improves it. Children learn both versions and modify them again. Knowledge accumulates socially even when no individual understands the full direction in which it is moving. Civilization is built through that accumulation. The anonymous farmer saving seed, the hunter learning to manage a herd, the craft worker shaping obsidian, the family repairing a mud wall, the community dragging a limestone pillar, the boatman carrying goods between settlements, and the administrator pressing marks into wet clay, all participate in the same immense process without ever seeing its beginning or end. Eventually their world becomes ours. Modern life still rests on ideas established during those distant millennia: permanent settlement, cultivated landscapes, domesticated animals, stored surplus specialized labor, long-distance exchange, inherited property institutions, administration and urban communities. The materials have changed. The scale has become almost incomprehensible. But the underlying experiment continues. Human beings still live inside environments constructed by previous generations, depending on systems no single person could create alone. The first village and the modern metropolis are separated by thousands of years, yet both depend on the same fragile achievement: strangers cooperating long enough to make permanence possible. The earliest builders started with earthstone, plants, animals, memory, and one another. From almost nothing, they created a world capable of outliving them. Word count 1 Oisworn. The last light settles over an ancient plain, and the ruins become difficult to distinguish from the earth that produced them. A low mound may contain 1,000 years of houses. Beneath grass and dust lie hearths where meals were prepared, floors where children slept, storage pits opened during hungry winters, and walls repaired by hands whose owners have been forgotten for millennia. There are no names left to attach to most of these lives. Their victories were too ordinary to be carved into stone, and their losses disappeared long before anyone learned to write them down. Yet their presence remains everywhere. It survives in the grain growing across modern fields and in animals whose ancestors once approached prehistoric settlements. It survives in the idea that a particular place can be home across generations. It survives in roads connecting communities, in markets filled with specialized goods, in buildings maintained by people who did not construct them, and in institutions expected to continue after those who currently manage them are gone. The first permanent world was never finished. It simply became inherited. Generation after generation added another layer, another wall, another field, another route, another rule, another solution to a problem created by an earlier solution. Villages became towns, some towns vanished, others became cities. Kingdoms eventually rose over landscapes where anonymous farmers had once planted small patches of grain. Empires would later claim those landscapes as their own, rarely knowing how ancient the foundations beneath them really were. Time has covered most of the beginning. Rain dissolved mud brick walls, rivers changed course, forests returned over abandoned fields, seas covered old coastlines. New settlements rose directly above older ones until centuries of human life became compressed into layers of soil. And perhaps that is the quietest truth left by the first builders. Civilizations can appear permanent while they're inhabited. Their walls seem solid, their routines seem natural, their systems seem as though they have always existed. But every human world is temporary. What lasts longer is the accumulation of knowledge passed forward, the memory of how to build, cultivate, cooperate, repair, adapt, and begin again. Across the darkening landscape, the earliest houses are gone. Their fires have been cold for thousands of years, but the world they started building is still around us.